Hello, everyone. It is I, Thor, God of Thunder, and the mightiest Avenger, here to tell you how to play me in Marvel Rivals. I'll be sticking to my mystery voice for the rest of the time instead of the Thor voice, but yeah, we're here to talk about Thor today. Thor is a really good off-tank who excels basically like a duelist in terms of 1v1ing opponents. He can deal a surprising amount of damage, and oftentimes characters do not give him the respect that he deserves in terms of closing gaps and dealing surprising amounts of burst. And I think a lot of the people that think he's weak or are surprised when I bring him into a game and absolutely clean up just don't know how to play him, and I think a big portion of that is because the game is completely misleading and does not explain to you how to play him at all. So we're going to start by explaining the abilities that Thor has. Then we're going to, thank you Thor, then we're going to look at some matchups for Thor and what he should be targeting and what he should be leaving alone, and then finally we'll look at some scenarios in game when you can use Thor and his abilities to really make your enemies' lives a living hell. The first step in learning how to play Thor is learning his abilities, and this is actually kind of a tricky step because the game does not do a very good job at explaining how these abilities work. In fact, it outright kind of lies to you in a lot of cases. So I'll be breaking down each of these abilities one by one. Let's start with his left click. His left click is just swinging his hammer around. They call it Mjolnir Bash. We'll just call it a left click. Left click does 45 damage. Hits about that fast. It's got a nice wide hitbox, so like with a lot of melee attacks, you don't have to be aiming directly at the enemy, which means you can usually trade pretty well when you're sticking to ranged enemies since they have to aim specifically to hit you. This also has an interaction with Thor Force, which is his passive you can see in the bottom right there. They sure do, Thor. Thor Force says that when you land a left click on an enemy, it instantly recharges one charge of Thor Force, which are those three hammers you can see in the center of the screen there. This seems true right there, right? However, you'll notice that when I use all of my hammers, when I'm low on hammers, and I'll hit an enemy, it works, but then it doesn't recharge a second hammer. What this actually means is that for every ability you use, you can recharge one hammer with the next hit of Mjolnir. And you can see there, you can recharge, but only one time per ability use. That means that we can use this to weave these abilities in between our attacks, and that's the most efficient way of generating lots of hammers and therefore generating lots of survival and damage. Because Thor Force's ability is when you use one of these hammers, you get 100 temp HP, that blue HP right there. It lasts for about 3 to 4 seconds, and then it starts to decay. It's really key to Thor's kit that he can generate lots of this temporary HP, because he can pull enemies away from healers. Both you and them will be isolated, but you have the sustain to keep the fight going because you can generate 100 temporary HP every couple of seconds, which is very nice for us. Okay, so now we need to talk about the actual abilities. Storm Surge is the first ability we'll look at. That's his shift ability. This is Thor's most important ability. Using it correctly is the difference between living and death and being a useful Thor or a useless Thor. It can do two different things, or it can move you around the map. It allows you to fly, get up to ledges and stuff like that. An uncharged version of it, just tapping shift, moves you 10 meters. Holding down shift for a full 2 seconds, which is the maximum charge, will send you 20 meters. When you charge into an enemy with it, you'll carry them 7 meters with an uncharged attack, or if it's a charged, it'll carry them 13 meters. This is really nice. You can knock enemies off of ledges with it, enemies that don't have recovery, but the most important thing to do with this is to move yourself around the map. Usually, I like to stick to just the short bursts unless I have time to actually set up. The short thrust has enough movement speed and is very quick, and the most important thing about it is it generates the most temporary HP per second, because you still only generate 100 temporary HP by fully charging the hammer. It's just as easy to tap this thing on cooldown and move yourself around the map like that. Let's watch a clip here where I abuse the hell out of this hammer and make these enemies chase me all over the map, trying to stop me from collecting health kits and just stalling the card out. Just block him. I got 3 on me. Oh man, I wasted so much time there. So as you can see, proper usage of the shift ability makes it nearly impossible for enemies to catch you because you have so much mobility, and every time you use it, you're generating 100 temp HP. Okay, let's go on to the E ability here. The E ability is probably the least useful ability on Thor, but it's free. It doesn't cost any hammers, and it just has a cooldown. Whenever you summon this, it'll give you 1 hammer back for every enemy that's inside of the radius. And it'd be nice if this gave you some extra buff, but the only other thing that it does is that when enemies cross the boundary of it, they take 40 lightning damage and are slowed temporarily, which is whatever. I mean, it's a little bit of damage, I guess. It's nice for trapping enemies in, and it's also nice for generating extra hammers in a pinch, especially if you've been jumping around a lot lately. Hammers regenerate passively every 5 seconds, but obviously you can use them faster than that by using your shift, and especially by using the next ability, Awakening Rune. Awakening Rune is the ranged mode. You press F, you go into this mode, you can throw your hammers at a long distance. And in this mode, instead of the 45 damage they did before, they do 70 damage. So it's a really, really big DPS increase. However, these attacks do have a travel time, and they can be hard to lead on enemies because they're not the fastest attacks in the world. The way I prefer to use this ability, and the way that I recommend you use this ability, is to use it at close range to boost your damage versus squishier targets. The extra benefit to using it at close range is it has a 3-meter radius around it that does 30 damage per second to every hero that's in that radius, enemy hero. This is not explained in the tooltip for whatever reason, but yeah, you'll do a little bit of extra damage, and then just a couple of hits, about 3 hits, you'll have done 210 damage, and those extra couple of ticks from that can evaporate some of the lower health characters in the game. I think this is kind of a noob trap ability. Yes, it does increase your damage quite considerably. However, when you have Awakening Rune active, you can see down there in the bottom right corner, I cannot use my shift ability, and therefore I'm incredibly vulnerable. If you're playing versus an enemy Thor, usually what I like to do is play passively without using Awakening Rune, and as soon as I see them go into their mode, I'm getting on their flank and I'm pulling them into my enemy team. So that they get evaporated, because they have no escape for 5 seconds, and you can't cancel the ability early. Alright, and then finally here we have Hammer Throw. Now Hammer Throw is a thing that a lot of people sleep on. They don't think it's powerful. It consumes a hammer and it doesn't, it's kind of hard to land. But Hammer Throw is free damage, and remember that we only generate a extra hammer every time we use an ability. So we have 2 choices when we're in melee with an enemy. We can either start with a shift and hit them, and then keep shifting and hitting them, and keep shifting and hitting them. This is great for displacing enemies, but if you're already in a situation with an enemy where you got them isolated, you got them to where you want them to be, and you're just trying to do the most damage possible, an uncharged shift like that does 40 damage, and it takes a lot of time out of when you could be melee attacking them. Compare that to just holding down left click and then throwing in right clicks as they happen, because this doesn't reset the swing timer at all, so you can just weave these hammer attacks in here for free. And we're generating tons and tons of temp HP, and we're doing way more damage. This is kind of like utilizing our F ability, because it's kind of like a halfway between, but it keeps us out of the F ability mode, and it makes us able to use the shift if we need to in a pinch. You'll notice that the shift ability and the right click, the hammer throw, share a cooldown. You can't use them like back to back. That would be really broken. But it allows you to choose, like, okay, yeah, the banner just transformed. He might get away and get to his team. Let's go ahead and use a shift there, and we'll finish him off with a hammer the next time it comes up. Otherwise, you are stuck in your F channel mode, and you might not be able to get away if you really need to, and you really can't position enemies, which is the most important thing about Thor, is repositioning enemies. So it's time to talk about Thor's last ability and his worst ability, his ultimate. His ultimate is kind of weak, but I think that's fair considering the rest of the character is very strong martially.
His ultimate jumps him up in the air. He hovers up there for a couple of seconds. He deals 40 damage every half second for 2.5 seconds, and then he comes crashing down. And this means, then the crashing down does 220 damage. So this means that you'll do a total of 420 damage. Nice. And the problem with it is that final hit is not enough to kill most characters, and if they're being healed at all, 40 damage per second isn't anything that's going to threaten them. The real issue being all of those lovely healer ults where everyone's grouped up and it would be the perfect time to drop the hammer on them. It's completely negating any damage that the Thor hammer does. So you can see here, it'll jump up in the air, and all those enemies below us are taking a bunch of damage, and then they're getting wiped out by the final hit. Generally, the damage you deal leading up to the final hit is more consistent because it hits everyone in the cone below you. That final crashing down a lot of times can get blocked by terrain and debris and all sorts of stuff. I'm almost never relying on this ultimate for anything. It is a very, very rare opportunity when you'll make any sort of considerable play with the ultimate itself. It's a nice thing to have sort of in your back pocket in case you see an opportunity, but don't go into an engagement thinking, oh my gosh, I have Thor ultimate, we're about to wipe them out.
Now, fair viewer, I, Thor, God of Thunder, beseech you. Please subscribe to Mystery, help his channel grow, and with it, we shall all ascend to godhood together.
Oh, I said Thor wouldn't come back, but he came back. And he gave me a plug too. What a nice guy. The last thing I want to talk about here in this video is the difference between a bad Thor and a good Thor. Some tendencies that you should strive to avoid if you see yourself employing them and you're having lack of success with this character, and some things that you should be doing instead. A bad Thor plays Thor as if he's a main tank. They don't understand that Thor has only 600-ish base HP, and that he can get withered away in a few seconds if players are actually focusing on him. He should be staying in cover, and he should be taking advantage of situations where enemies are not really focused on the fact that he exists at all. The second thing that bad Thors tend to do is that they engage with multiple enemies. This ties into the first point as well. They are the first one onto the point. They're hitting 1, 2, 3 enemies with their hammer. They're trying to get a lot of value out of their E ability, or they're jumping onto the point and just immediately trying to pick off the healer. That's not going to work for Thor, and oftentimes your heroism in leading the charge is going to make you the first player to die. Instead, you should be trying to look for players who have already isolated themselves by their positioning and finding your way to gap close on them and force a 1v1 and push them out of the range of their healers and their other DPS so you can take them out, and then circle around and do the whole thing again. A bad Thor also is very likely to use their F ability, their Ascended ability, or their ultimate at an inappropriate time. Using your F ability is a great way to boost some extra damage, but it does open you up to being very vulnerable since you can't reposition yourself, and you lose the ability to reposition enemies. Enemies are able to get away when you're using that ability because you can't shove them into a wall or into a corner. The other weak ability that Thor has is his ultimate, and players oftentimes will jump onto the point and immediately go into the ultimate. Well, there's nothing more predictable than a tank coming down the middle of the map and using their ultimate, right? So we want to be using this in times, both of these abilities, we should want to be using them in times where enemies are distracted. We should be capitalizing on the chaos that can unfold in the battlefield. If you see that the enemies are starting to get spread out and isolated by trying to avoid various DPS or overextend and try to catch up to their tanks so they can heal them, that's the time where you need to pop that F ability. That's the time where you need to drop the hammer on them. Bad Thors also tend to overcommit. They will jump into the fray and they'll get an enemy and they'll chase them to the ends of the earth because they're just that close to getting the kill. But that can lead you into overextending and getting killed by respawning enemies, or just generally not being helpful because you're chasing someone around when you could be doing something more important. You should also, as a good Thor, be having a safe space on the map that you return to frequently to get the health packs and get the healing from your team. I like to just have a side room that I know the timer on the health pack, and anytime I take an engagement and it's going poorly, I return there and I try to bait the enemy into coming into me and 1v1ing in that room. A bad Thor also is afraid of the objective. because they might feel like they aren't the main tank. They're not responsible for it. But as we can see in this clip here, a good Thor can be horrendously annoying on the objective. He can stall forever. Thor is kind of a short king as far as tanks go in this game. He stands on the ground, unlike some of these magic men out here, and he's not as tall as Groot or Hulk, so he kind of hides behind these carts, and he can stand there and block for a really long time. He can also use his abilities to move around quickly so the enemies can't hit him, and he can just stall out the cart forever. When it comes down to the overtime battle, he is the king because he can shove enemies off of the overtime points with relative ease. He just has to line up and he can push even, Omega Hulk off the point, no problem. And then finally, don't leave your team to die. Bad Thors oftentimes are too focused on the dive word in the dive tank. You can also be a counter dive tank. Because you have that ability to reposition enemies and bully them out of the enemy that they were chasing, if you have any one of the dive characters like Black Panther or whoever comes into the back line, you can use your shift ability to knock them out of the air or knock them away from your characters and start beating them down. Punish enemies that are having bad positioning, whether they're diving your lines or whether they're just overextending from the point. I like to hide on sort of a flank and wait for tanks to push far forward to get a few extra shots on our team, and then I'll hit them in the back and push them way out in front of where they meant to be, and they'll get picked off by our team. Anyway, guys, that's about all the tips I have at this point for Thor. I think he's a really, really fun character to play. I don't see him played very much at all. Maybe I'm the only person who's figured out that he's actually pretty damn good, but I think he is very, very viable all the way up into higher ranks. I am very nearly at Diamond myself, even though I've only played for about 30 hours so far, so I must have a good thing going with this character, I must imagine. Anyway, y'all, if you enjoyed the Marvel Rivals content, please let me know down in the comments, like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Mystery out. Bye.